want to have on the ark. After the expected snakes and lions, one boy said, "I would not want termites on the ark." I would like to add, I wouldn't want the mosquitoes that have been biting me lately, black-widow spiders, or some of the other creepy crawlies. The story of the ark in the flood is so old, so familiar to us as a beloved Sunday school story and baby-themed nursery wallpaper and linens. I wonder if we ever read this story shocked by the idea that God wants to destroy everything on a planet he had said he created very good. Bob Bell, who wrote the book Love Wins, reminds us that the Sumerians told flood stories, the Mesopotamians told flood stories, the Babylonians told flood stories, and I know that the Indians also told flood stories. There were even stories about people building boats to survive all these floods. In most of these flood stories, Bell says, all that water coming to destroy humanity was understood to be divine judgment for all of the ways that people had made a mess of things. The gods are angry, it was believed, and a flood was their way of cleaning the deck to start all over. But then this biblical story does something strange. It ends with the divine insistence that that is never going to happen again. And then this God, Bell says, brings a rainbow and a promise and a covenant. That was not how other flood stories ended. In those stories, the gods are angry and everybody dies and the gods are satisfied and that's the end of the story. But this God is different. This God commits to living with people in a new way, in a way in which life is preserved and respected. This story starts like the other flood stories started, but it goes somewhere different, somewhere new, somewhere better. So what and where is this betterness? Jacqueline Lapsey recaps biblical prehistory with these words. The evidence that the creatures God has made, and especially the human creatures, are extremely violent has been amassed almost since the beginning. The disobedience of the first couple, the disobedience of Cain, the relationship between humans and God are damaged, and then the relationship with humanity is damaged. What was so beautifully ordained in Genesis 1 is now utterly destroyed by violence. So perhaps it is not surprising that God would wish to do away with a project that has gone so badly awry. But here is where that new place becomes apparent. Because as she says, there is a yet in the story. God says, "Yet I will establish my covenant with you." God makes a covenant with the righteous Noah. God had made clothes for Adam and Eve, protected Cain from human vengeance, and now with Noah, looks to continue the relationship with humanity in spite of their overwhelming violence. But it isn't that God has stopped working against evil, but according to ELCA pastor Chris Duckworth, that God has decided that the nuclear option is not the way to go. That the cross and the dawning of the kingdom is the way to go. It's important to remember that this decision of God way back in Noah's times came with a predetermined high cost for God. For in keeping God's promise to not be violent towards creation, God would suffer the world's violence on his own person, in the person of Jesus. Now, some might object to God's apparent vengeance in this story, or see it as an example of the Old Testament's angry God in comparison with the New Testament's loving Jesus. But again, sometimes something gets lost in the translation. Scholars told me this week in my readings and my listening that the words in some verses just previous to what we read, the earth had become corrupt, we read in the English, and God's intended action then is to destroy. But it's the same word in Hebrew. I won't say it because it sounded a little like swearing in English, but it's as if God were saying, if you are going to be that way, I'll leave you to the results and the natural consequences of your behaviors. If you're going to do that, then that is what will happen to you. Same word. Your self-destructive ways will breed more destruction. Someone else put it this way: left to our own devices, that is, without God actively working for us, we will fall apart. Because the downward spiral of sin and humanity was on the way to annihilating itself. But the good news is God refused to allow that to happen. God acted to save humanity in the midst of its own destruction. The story of Noah and the flood demonstrates the good news that God elects to respond to human unfaithfulness, not with more judgment, but with grace. Grace emerges in this covenant with all creation. God elects grace over judgment. Pastor Lisa Lerner Hansen tells a story of working with a group of inner city sixth graders, and she was trying to help make this ancient story relevant to their own context. And so she asked them to envision a world in which there was no love or compassion, where people cared no more for the well-being of children than they did for adults, where food would be stolen and babies left to starve, where violence and death walked the streets, and no one was safe from the greed and brutality that every person participated in without another thought to another's well-being. One girl looked up and said, "That sounds like the hood where I live." Our human behavior is not so different from those in Noah's time. In fact, as technologies have exploded, we have more and faster ways of hurting the world and each other. It is like in his book, Whistling in the Dark, A Doubter's Dictionary by Frederick Buechner. He says that the church itself is thought of as a ship or Noah's Ark. We pointed that out. It's sort of like an upside-down boat there. It's a resemblance worth thinking about. In one, just as in the other, just about everything imaginable is on board. The clean and the unclean both. They are all piled in helter-skelter, the predators and the prey, the wild and the tame, the sleek and the beautiful ones, and the ones that are as ugly as sin. There are sly young foxes and impossible old cows. These are not words I would use. This is Buechner. Okay. There are the catty and the piggish and the peacock proud. There are hawks and there are doves. Some are as wise as owls, and some are as silly as geese, and some are meek as lambs, and others are fire-breathing dragons. There are times when they all cackle and grunt and roar and sing together, and there are times when you can hear a pin drop. Most of them have no clear idea just where they're supposed to be headed, or how they're supposed to get there, or what they'll find if and when they finally do. But they figure the people in charge must know, and in the meantime, sit back on their haunches and try to enjoy the ride. Buechner continues, it's not all enjoyable. There's backbiting, just like everywhere else. There's a pecking order. There's jostling at the trough. There's growling and grousing and whining. There are dogs in the manger and old goats and black widows. It's a regular menagerie in there. But even at its worst, there's at least one thing that makes it bearable within, and that is the storm without. The wild winds and terrible waves and all the watery wastes, no help in sight. And at its best, if never clear sailing, there is at least shelter from the blast. A sense of somehow heading in the right direction in spite of everything. A ship to keep afloat and like a beacon in the dark, the hope of finding safe harbor at last. Of course, as I mentioned a few weeks ago in a sermon, the church is not meant to be a harbor. It's meant to send us out to navigate life and to help others to do the same. But with the rainbow promise, God has promised to never leave us again to our own devices. So now what? In thinking about Noah, one of my text study buddies suggested this. God asks him to do this incredibly crazy, ridiculous thing, build a huge ark and fill it full of undomesticated, smelly, unhousebroken animals and wait for it to start raining. Now, it must have taken quite a while for Noah to build that ark, but he kept on working in spite of this seemingly crazy, ridiculous project that God had asked him to do, even though he couldn't really have understood God's request or where it all would lead. And on top of that, how crazy this must all have seemed, the fact that Noah was not exactly a young man. So what is United's ark? What crazy, ridiculous thing is God asking United to do? What ark are we in the middle of building? How crazy was it, in fact, for this small, not so young, we've got a lot of gray hair here, church to start a food bank, a clothing bank, and a lunch program? And God only knows, literally, God only knows, what impact those things have had on people, both our guests and our volunteers, who are experiencing what it means to make a difference for the sake of the gospel in this place. How there is often a wonderful overlap between those who are helping and being helped. If we at United keep following the seemingly crazy, ridiculous, or perhaps impossible feeling things that God is calling us to, where will it lead? Again, only God knows. I'd like to end with the following story, which I believe is a true one, from an online colleague. On a camping trip with his family during an evening at a campfire, the child asked, "So, Dad, why are there rainbows?" And Dad went into the very scientific explanation of spectrums and light refraction or diffraction, or teachers help me. Anyway, it was a very scientific answer, and his child looked at him and said, I know that, Dad. I learned all that from the Discovery Channel. What does it mean? See, the child knew intuitively that science can offer many explanations of what and how, but the Bible offers us insights into who and why and meaning. And so then the dad answered, "When it seems that the world has been taken over by bullies, the meaning of the rainbow is God's promise of newness and help." And then this brilliant son answered, "Well, that's a lot like our baptismal covenant." Exactly. There are signs all around. Rainbow, cross, font, bread, and wine. God's covenant continues, and our opportunities abound as God's people to join with God in care of creation and care of each other, all for the sake of helping others meet Jesus. What more could we ask for? Amen. I invite you to stand as you are able.